evening guys, and welcome to tonight's 10-minute mentor. Tonight's video is all about how to do an IEC paragraph. We use the IEC structure when we're writing evaluation questions in both the applied and A-level psychology. The assessment objective of AO3 is all about strengths and weaknesses, so it's evaluating and analysing the pros and cons of either different theories or different research methods. This is useful for both short answer evaluation questions, but also when we start writing extended responses and essays, IEC becomes the kind of godsend to help us get that top band answer. Now, in terms of what IEC actually stands for, it stands for Identify, Explain and Conclude. So your identify point, that is a clear signposting sentence that highlights and flags to the examiner the clear point that you're about to make. And we always start this off with something like one strength or one weakness of the theory or of the method is. So it's a really simple, clear sentence. Your explain point is then where you provide evidence and you elaborate on what that point is. So you say how that's a strength or how that's a weakness. So you use your knowledge from AO1 plus any relevant examples. So if there is evidence, such as a study or a particular example you can use to illustrate your point, that goes in the explain. And then finally, you've got the conclusion. That's the final sentence or so of your paragraph, where I like to call it the so what sentence, because you're saying to the examiner, so what? So why is this good or why is this bad? So you're giving the reason or the justification for the point you've just described and saying why that evaluates the theory that you're talking about. So you're linking it back to the initial identify point. So that's how we structure the evaluation point. Now, when it comes to actually writing them, the first thing you need to do in the identify is make sure you've got that key piece of terminology in there. So, for example, let's imagine you're evaluating repeated measures design. You would need to say that one strength of a repeated measures design is, and then state your point. So it's very clear what you're evaluating. The signposting sentence should be really obvious and clear that you've moved on to the skill of AO3 by the way that you've worded the point. So, for example, one strength for repeated measures design is that it reduces the risk of individual differences. That's the point you're making. If I was then explaining that point, I would need to go on to say, why does it reduce the risk of individual differences? So this is because is a good way to start your explain. This is because, and give me some context. So for the example of repeated measures, you would say, this is because there are different participants in each condition when doing independent measures. So individual differences could play a role. However, in a repeated measures design, because the same group of participants do all conditions, that means that any differences that are highlighted in one condition will be minimised in the other condition. So it kind of cancels each other out, and therefore it minimises that extraneous variable. In the conclusion, we need to say, well, if there's different people in each condition, in independent and the same in repeated measures, what's the benefit of minimising individual differences? Why is that a good thing? So the reason that that's a benefit is because if we can control extraneous variables, such as individual differences, we can prevent them from becoming confounding, allowing us to establish that cause and effect relationship between the variables. So a good sentence starter for when you're writing conclusions is to say whether or not the point that you're making adds or questions the validity of the thing you're evaluating. So if it's a strength, we would say that this adds validity to the theory or the method. If it's a weakness, we would say that this questions or reduces the validity of the thing you're evaluating. So in that point about repeated measures, it would add to the internal validity because it allows us to establish a causal relationship, making the results more accurate. So IEC is the structure of how to do AO3. Now, in terms of, well, how do I know when to use the IEC structure? It's being more familiar with the command words that are linked to that type of question. So command words such as evaluate, limitation, advantage. They're all indicators that it's a strength or weakness question and the IEC structure would be appropriate. As you move on to essay writing, you'll have command words such as discuss, which require both AO1 knowledge, but also the IEC structure and using AO3 as well. So practicing numbering the question using that decoding strategy to look at the words in the question, that will help you understand whether this structure is relevant or not. So we only use IEC when we're doing AO3. When we're doing AO1, or if we're doing an application paragraph, we would use a different structure, such as the neat paragraph structure. And I'm going to do a separate kind of 10-minute mentor video on how to do application questions, particularly how to successfully use the neat paragraph structure to get the most out of your answers and make sure you are linking to the stem. So my final tip for IEC would be making sure that you're asking yourself those questions as you're writing it. So when you write that first sentence, is it clear to an examiner reading this, the point you're making and about what theory or method? Does your explain include examples and is it elaborated? And does your conclusion say, this is a weakness or a strength because? Does it talk about how it adds or questions validity to the thing that you are evaluating? Now, apart from the IEC structure, the last thing that I wanted to mention on writing evaluation paragraphs is that you need to make it contextualised and linked to the particular theory or method that you are talking about. Now, if, for example, I'm evaluating a lab experiment, I would use phrases such as, it's in a controlled environment, which means that we can use standardised procedures, which makes it more reliable, more valid. Or alternatively, if I'm evaluating a lab experiment and saying what's bad about it, I would say things such as it lacks ecological validity and it's not very realistic or true to real life. But if we are evaluating a specific study, not just the method of a lab experiment, if we're actually evaluating, for example, in year 13, evaluating Ash's line study, it's important that we don't do a generic evaluation of the method. We know when we're evaluating something specific, in your explain bit where you include examples, you link that to the particular scenario, theory, or study that you're evaluating. So in Ash's line study, we would say it's a lab experiment. There are high levels of control and standardized procedures, such as all of the participants having the same instructions or all of the participants being shown the same lines for the experiment, the same number of confederates in each condition. So you're contextualising your example to the specific thing you're evaluating, because otherwise it's generic and it's kind of too simplistic. So you've got to make sure you've got those contextualised links to allow you to do that. Okay, and if you find that we struggle with that, I can do a separate video on contextualising where I can go through some examples on the board of how you would add more detail to a basic evaluation paragraph to improve it and to make it more contextualised, because that's the only risk with evaluating methodology, is that we sometimes run the risk of being too generic, and making sure that it's linked to the question is essential for top marks. So I hope you found that useful. When it comes to practicing your evaluations, I would do one of two things to help you revise them. The first thing is I would create a summary table like you've got in the booklets of the pros and the cons, and have a column for each of the parts of the IEC. So have a column saying identify, where you list if it's a strength or a weakness. A column for explain, where you summarise in just one bullet point the point that you're trying to make or the example you're going to use. And then in the conclusion column, you add the key words such as increases internal validity, limits ecological validity. So you're saying how you're going to conclude the point by commenting on what is being affected. Once you've summarised all of the points from the booklet into your IEC tables, you can then condense those onto a single flashcard, you can test yourself, and then you can practice writing them out. The key thing is don't forget to revise AO3. Your evaluations, especially when we move on to essay questions, are actually worth more marks in the exam than your knowledge questions. Okay, evaluation in an essay is worth more marks, so it's essential we don't forget to revise our IECs and make sure that we're just as confident on the key terms and knowledge as we are on the strengths and weaknesses of each method or theory. So hopefully you found that useful. If you've got any specific questions, comment down below or send me a message on the Instagram account, which I'll tag down in the comments. And again, if you've got any specific requests for any other videos or certain things that you want to know, then please do let me or the rest of your teachers know so that I can get some videos recorded for next week. Thanks so much.